Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams. Thanks for joining me again, Daniel.
Thank you, Jay. It's good to be back with you.
Always good to hear the latest news going on with American foreign policy. It's not necessarily good news that we hear. In fact, most of the time I would characterize it as anything but good news. But in any event, let's talk about a few of the things that are on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website, starting with a discussion you had with Dr. Paul just today, I believe, and I should remind my listeners that Daniel and Dr. Paul do a daily video discussion that you can go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity to watch, and I would encourage you to do that. But the discussion today had to do with U.S. failure in Iraq and Syria. Troops on the way is the question. So it seems as though the more we get involved in some of these countries, the more chaotic things get. The more we have to get involved, the more chaotic things get. But ISIS seems to be, if they're our enemy, we certainly aren't winning. It seems as though they're picking up more and more strength all over the place there, aren't they? Talk to us a little bit about what you and Dr. Paul talked about today in Syria and elsewhere, Iraq and Syria, I guess.
Yeah, well, Iraq and Syria is one. There's even more good news or bad news, however you want to look at it. It's about ISIS. It's funny. It was just a couple of weeks ago, unless my memory is gone, that Obama came out and said we're making great progress in this war against ISIS. And since he said that, Ramadi in Iraq, the capital of the Anbar province, which your listeners remember was the scene of the great victory in the surge, supposedly, that fell to ISIS a few days ago. And then I believe it was yesterday that Palmyra in Syria fell to ISIS. That's significant because it's the first time that a town that was solidly in the control of the Syrian government, a major population center, was taken over head-on by ISIS. They now control this. It's also an important World Heritage Site for UNESCO. There are some important antiquities there that I'm sure will be soon blown up by these guys.
Oh, boy.
And then we see just today that ISIS is still on the march. They're in Africa too, and they took over Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte. So it's a triple play. Isn't that a hat trick in hockey?
Yes.
It's a hat trick they've pulled, and they're on the march. And this is all the while the U.S. has been bombing since August. If anything, it seems that the U.S. bombing is helping give them strength rather than undermining their strength, Jay.
Yeah. It just doesn't make any sense, as I've said more and more. What's going on here, Daniel?
Well, I wonder, I don't know the answer, frankly, but I wonder, are U.S. military planners totally incompetent? The people who told Obama, hey, we'll have a few bombs over there and all will be taken care of, are they just incompetent? Or as some people, and I think Ron Paul's chief among them, say, is it true that bombing and attacking ISIS is just what they want because it's the greatest recruiting poster they could possibly be given? So they're being ironically strengthened by being supposedly weakened. That's possible. Is it possible that airstrikes alone cannot defeat an army on the ground? I think a lot of military planners would agree with that, and so therefore there was never any chance of a victory with the strategy they had. Or is the option, window 4, that the U.S. just does not want to defeat ISIS and somehow is in cahoots with them? That's the hardest for me to believe, although it's hard to discount unless you believe that they're just so darn incompetent that everything they do seems to strengthen ISIS. So I don't know. Those are the 4 possibilities that I've come up with. Maybe it's a combination of all of these. Yeah. I don't know exactly. How does it strike you, Jay?
Well, I'm wondering if there certainly an element must be that there's an awful lot of money made by selling weapons. I was talking to Richard Mayberry on my radio show this last week, and he was talking about these major defense contractors, how they're selling weapons to everybody, and Richard sort of has a little different idea about investing in defense companies. I call them offense companies. His idea is that he says that all these major defense contractors, they sell to everybody. He says, now, if you tell defense contractors they can't sell weapons, and you're telling them that they can't that nobody's allowed to defend themselves. This is Richard's spin on it, which I don't necessarily buy. But the notion is, he says that these defense contractors, some of the best in the world we have here, and they're selling their weapons everywhere, and they don't care who they sell to. They're just making lots and lots of money. Now these guys, as you know better than I probably, Daniel, have tremendous influence in our Congress. Is it possible that just this short-term interest of making filthy amounts of money by selling weapons allows, is what's driving this in part?
Well, I think they convince themselves that they're doing good, and I think although Mayberry is obviously a smart guy and a very good guy, I think he's probably convinced himself, maybe to cover a guilty conscience, but they convince themselves that they're doing good, that these are good things. And I don't think it hurts that they are able to make stupendous amounts of money. But, Dr. Paul mentioned on his Liberty report today, and this is something I hadn't read, but it's just so in going with what you brought up, Jay, that the U.S. military has announced that it's sending in 1,000 anti-tank missiles into Iraq. Oh. And the reason they're doing that is because when ISIS overtook Ramadi, they also overtook tons and tons of U.S. tanks. And so now ISIS has all of our tanks in Ramadi, so the U.S. taxpayer is now having to pay for missiles to destroy the tanks that it paid for in the first place.
Yeah.
So as I said on the show, they're probably popping corks at Raytheon right now.
Well, exactly right, Daniel. And I'm wondering if that might not be, the driver. And so that people that have influence in Congress keep getting these bills passed, money keeps getting allocated or not allocated, just somehow the military seems to have access, the military-industrial complex has access to money. And, I suppose from a Keynesian point of view, hey, the Keynesians figured it was okay to dig a hole and fill it back up, dig a hole, fill it back up, doesn't matter as long as you got people working and you put money in their pockets. So, hey, kill people, destroy weapons, build new ones, destroy buildings, build new ones. What's the difference? Kill a few people along the way. Who cares, right?
What's funny? Yeah, what else is funny about this that I found amusing? Dr. Paul also brought this up. Not amusing, but he also brought this up that the great experts, the military experts on CNN and all these other channels. This just happened to be a CNN general, which they have in as their experts. He said, well, the real problem here in Iraq and Syria is that these centralized governments are just too destabilized. They're just not strong enough. That's the real problem. And, of course, as we know, the reason why the Syrian government is destabilized and not strong enough to face up to ISIS is because the U.S. for the past 4 years has been trying to overthrow it.
Right.
The U.S. has been funding all of these jihadists and calling them moderates, and they've attacked the Syrian government to the point where they can't do anything about it. And the same is true in Iraq. If you remember, it wasn't long ago when the U.S. was supporting the overthrow of Maliki, and they've fiddled here and there and done all sorts of things to destabilize. And now that we see Libya, Gaddafi's hometown, overtaken by ISIS, that's just completely obvious what happened there. The NATO invasion in 2011 turned it into an absolute chaos. So everywhere you see ISIS on the rise, it's because of U.S. and NATO and Western policy, Saudi Arabian, Israeli, Turkish policy of undermining and destabilizing these countries. So even if the U.S. doesn't come out and claim that ISIS is its partner, in a way it may as well do so, because everything they've done is to benefit ISIS.
Yeah, it's incredible. It really is. And I have to think somehow, former President Eisenhower is rolling over in his grave when he thinks about the warnings. He really warned us about this. And I think, anyway, it's just Congressman Paul had an article on the website as well, titled "New Military Spending Bill Expands Empire but Forbids Debate on War." Could you comment on that a little bit, Daniel?
Sure. That was his column for this past week, and I think one of the most important points he makes in this column, and it goes along with what we were just discussing, is that the National Defense Authorization Act for 2016 went through the House this last week, and the House leadership allowed for 130 some amendments. And as one journalist wrote, I forget where, to the most minute things like regulation of fire hoses.
Jeez.
Those were all allowed to be debated. However, a critical amendment, I think it was offered by Walter Jones from North Carolina, or at least co-authored by him, simply would have allowed to have a debate and a vote on this U.S. war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Well, that was ruled out of order.
Oh,
That was not allowed to be debated. So we can debate fire hoses, but we cannot debate a major war. But of course, at the same time, Congress fully funded the war. So it passed and approved the money for a war that it refuses to debate.
well,
Is that not dysfunctional in the truest, most concise definition of the term?
oh, it absolutely is. It's just absurd. It really is. Now we haven't talked about the Ukraine much lately. What's going on there? I know that there was another article I think that you wrote, Daniel. You said anytime U.S. official visits, some high-level official visits Ukraine, some attacks always seem to occur afterwards.
Yeah, that was an interview I did on RT, and we put the video up on the Ron Paul Institute website as well. But it was the question. It was that right after Victoria Nuland, she first visited Kiev, then she visited Russia. Right after she left Kiev, the Ukrainian government started shelling East Ukraine again, and it was the first civilian death they've caused since the ceasefire began a few months ago now. And so the questioner was asking, is this something that's happening on its own, or is this something the U.S. has green lighted? And I think the point I was trying to make is that the U.S. implicitly green lights everything that Ukraine does. The U.S. military is on the ground in Ukraine. They're training Ukrainian troops, just like in Vietnam. The trainers are there on the ground. They're offering, at the very least, things like Humvees and all sorts of gadgets like this. They're offering to the Ukrainian government. And what does that do? That gives you a green light. There's the implicit approval by the United States for what your foreign policy is, or in Ukraine's case, it's a domestic policy. It's attacking its own eastern part of its country. So certainly they are doing what they think is the bidding. I think there's a slight wrinkle in this scenario, however, and I'm not prepared to do what some people have done and claim that the U.S. is backing down. Even people like Patrick Smith at Salon, who I think is a terrific writer and has great insights, I think he's a little too optimistic that the U.S. has recognized the folly of its ways in Ukraine. But we have seen Kerry, for example, had 7 hours worth of meetings with Lavrov and Putin this past week, which I think is pretty significant. Everyone is speculating about what they said. I'm not going to speculate because I have absolutely no idea. But just in and of itself, him going there and talking for this long of a period, I think is enormously significant. And so I think there might be some shift. And one final thing on Ukraine is that while Kerry was in Russia, Poroshenko in Ukraine, who was this U.S.-backed president, he started going on about how we're going to defend the full Ukraine with every drop of our blood. We're going to attack the airport in the east again. And Kerry made some kind of comment to the effect of he needs to cool it a bit.
Yeah.
So that's the first time we've ever seen a public rebuke of Poroshenko.
Yeah.
So there might be some things there. There might be some tea leaves at the bottom of the cup. But so I think we keep an eye on it and see what happens.
Yeah, we can be hopeful, perhaps. I'm just thinking, remembering how, how the German and French leaders met up with Putin some time ago and didn't include the United States. That there certainly are some concerns from Europe about the sort of the rhetoric and the heating up of anti-Russian influence from the United States. I mean, the Europeans are much more concerned about hostility towards Russia than we seem to be, for economic reasons as well as for their own safety. I mean, they don't want another war in their on their continent.
I think that's. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jay.
So maybe a relationship with Europe is coming into play a little bit with respect to our neocons.
We can hope so, but if we had a dime for every time we wish the Europeans would stand up for an independent, sovereign foreign policy, we would be vacationing somewhere, Jay. So I don't.
Well, exactly right. Ever since World War II, of course, I think that Europe. I mean, why do we keep troops in Europe and Japan, elsewhere, unless we're looking to keep control of making sure everything goes the way our ruling elite wants them to go?
Yes.
So the Ukraine, yeah, we'll be watching that. And then just one more thing, Daniel, today, if I could ask you, perhaps quickly to comment on Macedonia. It's something we talked about. Last week seemed to be Victoria Nuland and George Soros doing their dirty deed again there, cooking up trouble, trying to create chaos. What's the latest? Seems things might be cooling down there a little bit for the moment, at least.
For the moment, I think. But remember, these things can be turned on to high heat at a moment's notice. You have everything in place. As you pointed out, the U.S. government, the U.S. Embassy, USAID, and all of the various George Soros organizations have been heavily funding and heavily supporting the opposition NGOs in Macedonia. And this is not a conspiracy theory. You can go to their websites. You can go to, I think it's Civitas is one of the main ones or something of that nature, and you'll see right on the bottom, proudly supported by the U.S. Embassy. So this is open source, open stuff, not conspiracy. It's fact. They've been supporting this. The U.S. has been interested in overthrowing the government of Macedonia because Macedonia has indicated its willingness to participate in the Turk Stream pipeline project, which would bring Russian gas into Europe.
Yeah, so you can't have that.
Yeah, so the when we last spoke, it was just on the cusp of a big demonstration in Macedonia that was to take place on Saturday of the opposition. The opposition did take to the streets. I think there were about 10,000 of them. They tried to occupy some areas like they did in Maidan in Ukraine, but it wasn't a huge show up of people. And then on Monday, there was a counter-protest of people supporting their government, of course, which had been democratically elected, and that drew well over 100,000 people.
Oh, good.
So I think, although by the math of the regime changers, 100,000 is less than 10,000. If that 10,000 are doing the right thing, still I think it's a little bit even too difficult for them to deny that this could be a problem. So. But they'll wait. They've got plenty of time. They'll try again. I think there's no question about it.
Well, Daniel, we supposedly fought World War I to make the world safe for democracy. And now whenever the democracies spring up that do things that we don't like, we send in George Soros and his pit bulls, and we stir up trouble, and we get an overthrow of that government. And then we somehow put in our own guy that will block Putin's pipeline in this case, and give our military-industrial complex what they want, essentially, huh?
I think you've nailed it right on the head.
And at the same time, then, of course, we tell our young men and women who go away to fight these wars that they're fighting exactly for those ideals of American democracy. That's incredible. It's incredible. Yeah. It's just absolutely... But people don't care. They don't seem to know. But anyway, some do. And people listen to our discussions, Daniel. I'm very heartened to know that there are quite a few people that listen. So we have to start out where we can, do what we can, I guess. So thank you again for being with me to update us this week, and we'll look to do it again hopefully next week.
Thank you, Jay, for having me back.